Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. Thanks for joining us for our regular strategy conversation with leading thinkers that's dedicated to the memory of one of the nation's most influential strategists, Andy Marshall. Joining us today is Dr. Eliot Cohen, the Dean of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and one of the nation's leading strategic thinkers. Dr. Cohen, welcome back.
Great to be back with you.
And I should take a moment to give a shout out to all of our sponsors. Given that we're going to be covering a lot of ground, our global coverage is sponsored by Leonardo DRS. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and broader cyber coverage. Fincantieri, Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage. And of course, Bell sponsors this podcast. Eliot, I want to start off with the administration's response, particularly overseas. There is a criticism of the administration that it hasn't responded not only quickly enough in the United States, but in not helping our allies. And in that vacuum, China, Russia, and Cuba have swept in to help nations spanning from Italy to Spain to even the United Kingdom and others. Nations remember those who helped them in a time of need. What do you see as the broader ramifications of this crisis, whether in changing the international order or how folks should be thinking about not only great power competition, but challenges going forward?
I think there are at least two main impacts, possibly a third. The first impact is, in a way, the issue is not whether we've shipped a couple hundred ventilators to a particular country. It's that this is really the first major crisis of its kind where the United States has just said, we're not going to exercise any leadership whatsoever. This is all about us. That's not how we reacted to Ebola. That's not how we reacted to AIDS. Both the previous presidents, Obama and Bush, when confronted by epidemics, said the United States has to help lead the solution to it. So I think that's the first thing that really strikes us. The second is that the American response itself looks bumbling and incompetent. And the federal government looks bumbling and incompetent. And I'll be brutal about it. I think the way the president has presented himself on television, it's very disheartening. I mean, it just looks like the United States does not have its act together. And, that there's a reputational hit there when you look like you're a country which can't really act coherently and decisively. It's everybody was sort of surprised by that. I think that's fine. But, the press reports these tussles between the federal government and the governors, kind of clashing decisions and rules and so forth. And it sends out a pretty bad message, actually, about the effectiveness of the United States government. The third possible impact is that this crisis will really, and actually it's not possible, it's almost certain, is going to change how people think about security in a number of ways. For one thing, obviously, people are going to take pandemic preparation a lot more seriously after that's no doubt about that. But I think it's not too early to begin thinking about the second and third order consequences of what happens if, for example, you have a sustained recession or even a depression. How it affects people's views of international travel, how it affects views of being dependent on global supply chains, how it affects people's fundamental sense of optimism about the world. Those are all intangible, but they're all really important. And I think they will also have a national security impact.
There's also, the sort of the law of unintended consequences as well of action or inaction. Italians feel abandoned by their allies and friends, and 70% now oppose the European Union. And U.S. troops are in Italy and still were not seen as helping the country out. And there's this sense that if your friends won't send you ventilators, they may not send you troops when you're in need. and China and Russia certainly are watching this. Could this be the unhinging of what we have regarded as foundational security organizations, whether it's NATO or a further unraveling of the EU? You know, at first it was just the British question, but now there's this sense that there are other countries that are looking with great skepticism to these organizations. Is that a danger, do you think?
Well, the first thing is, sometimes these perceptions are out there, but they're not accurate. I believe it's the case, don't hold me to it, but I believe it's the case that actually Italy has gotten more aid from Europe than, say, it did from China. It's just that the EU is not particularly good at advertising that. But more broadly, here's, it seems to me, the way to think about it. As a friend of mine put it, it's not that this changes things, but it accelerates things. So I think some of the centrifugal forces in Europe and other parts of the world that were there before just get sped up in the same way that, at a much more mundane level, universities. We were doing some online teaching before, and we were using Zoom for teleconferencing or for conducting some classes virtually. Well, all of a sudden we've gotten up to speed a lot more quickly on that than anyone could have anticipated, and there will be consequences from that. So I think you can argue that these old structures were under strain before. I don't think this changes that. It just may accelerate the pace at which change comes.
There's the tendency of looking at China as primarily a military adversary to be countered, whether by better weapons or better cybersecurity, rather than with ventilators, masks, and generosity, right? Whether or not it's accurate that China was more helpful, there's a perception that China was more helpful, which is and a perception which the Chinese have only been feeding in order to sort of protect themselves from criticism for having mishandled this crisis at a fundamental level. But in the background, China appears to be making gains without fighting, which is one of the fundamental tenets of Chinese strategy, right? Indonesians have sort of backed away from territorial claims, in part because the Chinese have been sort of assertive about this. What's the best way to be countering the Chinese messaging, perhaps also exacerbated by sort of active Russian measures at dissembling about this virus? What's the right way for the United States and its allies to be countering China at this important time?
So, there's, on the one hand, the war of what we used to call propaganda, what some people call soft power or subversion, publicity. And that goes on all the time. And, you fight that battle in different ways. And the Chinese have gotten better and better at it, to be sure. Staging dramatic moments where you have cases of supplies being offloaded or various other campaigns to win influence. But there's also fundamental realities. And I think in the long run, the fundamental realities win. And in this case, there are two elements to that. First is, it doesn't make a difference how good your propaganda is if the United States actually is not exercising leadership. You can't successfully really make up an image of yourself that's too far from reality, or you can't do that for very long. But that also applies in the other direction, particularly to the Chinese. And I think the Chinese have two problems. One, of course, is that we know that they did conceal the outbreak early on, and they were, in the most charitable way one could put it, misleading about its extent early on. And are still probably being misleading about the number of deaths and so forth in Wuhan. But there's a second, and in some ways this may be a bigger problem for me. If you look at the Johns Hopkins dashboard that my colleagues at the Whiting School of Engineering at Hopkins have put up, you'll see that the Chinese are, even at a time when the United States is now reporting hundreds of thousands of cases, as we're talking, it's over 600,000. China is still down there as having about 83,000, and that really strains credulity.
Right.
It really does. It's just very hard to believe that the Chinese have such perfect control of the place and such shrewdly aggressive public health measures, that they've really been able to really make the spread negligible, starting a few weeks ago. And I, like many other people, wonder whether actually there isn't a further, probably much larger wave of COVID infection that will hit China as well. And when that happens, I think, or if that happens, I should say, I mean, it's conceivable that the Chinese really have contained it, which would be pretty astonishing.
Or effectively contain the spread of the news about it, right?
Yeah, but sooner or later the news will come out.
Right.
And when that does, I think that would undermine a lot of the the soft power advantages that they've been able to take away from this.
Do you think that, and there is, there are sort of two parallel concerns. One is that we will become so self-absorbed because of this crisis and focus inwardly that will also give China an opportunity. But there is also a concern that should these supply lines move out of China, as many expect some will, that will perhaps encourage Beijing to be much more adventurous externally for internal political reasons and nationalistic reasons, right? I mean, one of the compacts of the Chinese system is you trade freedom for both security and economic prosperity. And if the state's not able to give you security, which has been undermined because of the virus, or economic prosperity, it's very problematic. Do you think that China in this period could become actually more dangerous vis-a-vis whether it's, invading Taiwan, as some people fear, or get more aggressive with Hong Kong, or more muscular with other nations in the region?
I suppose it's conceivable, but it seems to me the critical thing here is: do the Chinese feel that the regime is under strain? That's really the critical issue, and is it under threat? And I think they, early on in the crisis, they most definitely felt that way. Do they still feel that way? I don't know, but I think that's, there may be an opportunistic element to this, but I suspect that the dominant concern is that they want to make sure that the regime is not threatened by the latest twist and turn in the pandemic.
One of the things that you mentioned at the top, which other strategists are also discussing, is whether or not this reorders how people fundamentally think about security. And if you look at it, there is a realization that despite $750 billion in annual defense spending, more Americans have died to date than they did in 9/11 or the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And indeed, you'd have to go all the way back to World War II for fatality rates of Americans this high. And even then, it wasn't on the civilian side as it is today. How does this restructure sort of how folks will regard security going forward and think about security going forward?
I don't think it will. I mean, I may be wrong, but I don't think it's going to have a huge impact on how people think about military security. I do think, unquestionably, people will think about security from pandemics as a critical function of the federal government, and will want to see that that's adequately funded and that there's adequate preparation for it. But I guess I don't see that you'll have a whole bunch of people just say, okay, we don't really have to spend any money on defense because the real big issue is pandemics.
Right.
I mean, this thing will come to an end sooner or later, and either before then or after that, there'll be something that blows up. We say, yeah, you need ships and tanks and boots on the ground and that sort of thing. So in the long run, I don't think it makes a difference. And there will be a big, big investment, as there absolutely should be, in the infrastructure that's necessary to keep us healthy and safe.
Um, those,
Let
how,
me add one other. Well, let me add one other thing
please.
there, Vega. I think one impact of this we have not really thought nearly hard enough about is what's the explosion of this? What are going to be the consequences of the explosion of this thing in the Middle East, in Africa, in South America, and in some other parts of Asia as well? We're it is staggering. You look at the number of cases in Italy; it's 165,000. But then, if you begin scrolling down and looking at uh, countries in, say, the Philippines, 5,400, Mexico, 5,400. The numbers just look really. Egypt, 2,500.
Right.
Um, those numbers are, maybe they're accurate, but they feel really, really small,
Right.
at least to me. And it makes me, and particularly if when you're looking at countries which don't have the strongest healthcare systems, probably what you're looking is at a lot of unacknowledged spread, or spread that is really just now in the early stages. And of course, what we've seen in the United States is how quickly this thing can spread.
And especially in places, right, with far greater poverty, far lower public health
Right.
standards and hygiene standards, right? I mean, that's a concern whether it's in India, Pakistan, and certainly elsewhere. Do you think? How do you think the United States? There are those who argue that this crisis and the amount of federal spending that will be required, as you mentioned, right, an increasing recognition that this could be a depression and not just a recession. The amount of resources and pressure that this is going to put already on an indebted nation. States themselves are also groaning under an extraordinary debt load that's going to get more pronounced given that tax revenue is also going to drop at a state level, state and local level. And there's this concern that actually that defense spending could take a bigger hit. Strategically, how does the department need to think about this period to ensure that we exit this? Because business as usual is unlikely going to carry us through sort of the strategic inflection point that we're in, right? How does the department need to really seize the initiative here?
I think the department needs, in a way, to act the way other prudent organizations do in the middle of this, which is you think in two buckets. One is, what do I do to mitigate things right now? If you suddenly get hit with cuts and whatever. But then if the budget does get cut, and we don't know that it will be, although it very well could be, that you think, okay, how do I do that to actually make strategic improvements? How do I do that? It's the old hackneyed saw about you never let a crisis go to waste. If there are things that you really wanted to cut out, but you couldn't cut out because there were political interest or the bureaucratic opposition was too tough, now's the time to cut, and actually to cut deeper than you really need to cut so that you can invest in the things you want to invest in.
Let me take you to an issue about military leadership. One of the most important elements of military capability is, in fact, leadership. And that's somewhat under question right now. Pentagon leaders knew how bad the situation in China was, but decided against acting, much less preparing in certain cases, in part because of fear of running afoul of the president. It appears that the former acting Navy secretary who resigned decided to fire the commanding officer of an aircraft carrier, in part because he thought that that's what President Trump would have wanted him to do. You and I spoke at the Halifax International Security Forum, where we are regulars. Thankfully, one of the world's truly great security gatherings. And we talked about this because at the time, Richard Spencer was going through his own challenge vis-a-vis the White House at the time, the Navy secretary, over the issue of the White House's involvement in disciplining a SEAL. Do we have a crisis in military leadership?
Well, we certainly have a crisis in the civilian leadership. The case of the acting Navy secretary is just I mean, it was just egregious. That was such poor judgment, such poor leadership from the get-go. So, you know, there's always a point where you decide I'm going to do the right thing, and I'll, you know, if the president gets mad at me, the president will get mad at me. He chose not to do that. He made a hasty decision instead of letting the normal chain of command do its thing, and then he flew out there, you know, spending $250,000 on the taxpayer's nickel to give an extraordinarily stupid, insensitive, incompetent speech, refused to take questions, and flew back. And I think it was pretty clear that he was toast. Now, the thing is, having said that, I don't mean to beat up on him because he pretty clearly should never have been in that position. And this is where you see, I think, some of the consequences of the inability of the administration to staff itself with competent people. And that's because they rule out all kinds of people who might otherwise serve on the grounds that they're not politically okay. And it's because of the president's, the administration's affinity for mediocrities, who are kind of servile, and it's because of a tone of obsequiousness that's been set. So I'm concerned about that. You know, I like Secretary Esper, but I think if you know, the people who make the Pentagon run, as we all know, are the undersecretaries and the assistant secretaries and the deputy assistant secretaries and the service secretaries on the civilian side, that is. You know, on the military side, I think the military leadership is, as it ever was, dutiful, but inclined to keep its head down. But they don't really have much choice on that. The only advice I would give to military friends, and to some extent I've actually already given them that, is, you know, do what's right. I've always, you know, there's always a running conversation about at what point should the generals resign. And my view is they almost never should resign, but they should be willing to be fired. And, you know, what's critical is for them to do what's right, not to be stupid, but to do what's right. And, you know, let the chips fall where they may. I think on the whole, they've done okay, actually. I mean, I'm not disappointed with the military leadership thus far. They're in an extraordinarily difficult position, but the real responsibilities, I think, fall on we've had some pretty weak civilian leadership in the kind of mid to upper levels of the Pentagon.
And a lot of which, unfortunately, has been hollowed out over time in terms of keeping some of these positions fully staffed.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about sort of strategic decision making and strategic thinking. One of the things that the United States, I think, actually historically has been remarkably good at is actually seeing what's coming down the pike and preparing for it. So this whole old saw about we've never really been good at it, I find not very compelling. I mean, in World War II, we war gamed every element of a Pacific War with Japan, with the exception of kamikazes. So we kind of thought through what are the capabilities, what are the systems, marshaling the industrial resources of the country, and being able to move with some alacrity. And we've done that time and again, and we did so throughout the Cold War. But there seems to be sort of this slowness in reacting and acting to China, for example, or the advancement of Russian capabilities. That is a little alarming, right? I mean, we thought when this administration took over, there was going to be some motion. Then some of the hard decisions were delayed. And then it was, there'll be a masterpiece budget. And well, one more year. And, Secretary Esper has been talking about making the heavy muscle movements in 22, which seems to be an awful long time to sort of reorient yourself, especially when you read the kind of way the Chinese will work to confront us, as Bob Work explained, former Deputy Defense Secretary a few weeks ago. What do you attribute this slowness to? I mean, shouldn't there be a greater sense of urgency?
Well, sure.
How we react?
I think it's a couple of things. To some extent, it's the result of the overhang of Iraq and Afghanistan and people being preoccupied by those concerns and finding it hard to devote resources and brain power to these larger questions. But I think it's also the case that we came out of the Cold War with a really big military establishment, and with big ponderous bureaucracies, and they just find it very hard to turn on a dime. And you really need some inspired leadership to be able to do that. So, I mean, one person I will plug is General Dave Berger, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, who I think really has kind of grappled with the strategic challenge, whether people agree with him or not. So you're really dependent on having leadership of that kind, and even there's a danger you can be outweighted. I've often thought that some of the original sin in all this does go back to administration. I was part of the George H.W. Bush administration, which probably did not cut nearly enough after the Cold War. And in a way, it goes to where we were at the beginning of this segment. There's an argument for cutting quite deep, and in part so you can garner the resources to invest in new things and different things. And I think we lost that moment.
Do you get a sense that will our allies be with us in a few years, or are we on a very divergent track? I mean, for example, South Koreans are very, very upset at the administration's decision to furlough half of the 9,000 employees that support the 23,000 Americans that are based there, in part because the administration wants $5 billion out of Seoul, $5 billion, which the Koreans believe, I think somewhat rightfully, is a little bit too much, especially after how much more they're paying than they used to pay to support U.S. forces there. There's concern about whether more steel and aluminum tariffs will be applied to Europeans. At the end of the day, is this a healable divergence, or is this something that is somewhat more strategic?
I think it's, first, it varies by which ally you're talking about. It depends in part on the world circumstances a couple of years from now where this might matter. And I think an awful lot does hinge on the election. I mean, if we will have had 8 years of America first with everything that means for our alliances, then I think the damage is permanent. Nothing in life is forever, but it would be close to irreparable, I believe.
Let me end on a more lighthearted note. After many years, you are joining the online learning community. Talk to us about how your ever-popular Shakespeare course will be taught via electronic means as opposed to your visage delivering it in person, which is always a treat for anybody's academic career.
Well, thank you for asking that. Actually, the president of the university asked me to participate in a program called Hopkins at Home, and this is outreach to our alumni, and put on a mini course on Shakespeare. It's about a 6-week course, and it's actually, we use the Coursera website. It's a smaller group right now because there's a lot of use of chat rooms and so on, but when it's all done, it's going to be opened up. And it's been fascinating to me because genuine online education, as opposed to virtual education. In other words, we've had to, like everybody else, we had to shift in mid-stride during the spring semester to virtual education. So everybody learns how to use Zoom, and you kind of give your normal lecture the way you would do it, except you're staring at a screen instead of at 25, 30 people in front of you. Genuine online education is different. So they're much shorter lectures. You structure assignments or suggestions or those sorts of practical kinds of things very, very differently. And I have enjoyed actually learning that technique. We have a wonderful online distance learning program, wonderful staff. They've been walking me through it. I have to learn some new software. There's something called Panopto. But I think this is, for us, for SAIS in particular, this is an opportunity, which we are taking advantage of. We are training up our faculty who have embraced this on using these tools, learning how to be in this space. And I think that's really the right approach. And it's the right approach in many spheres of life. This is a terrible crisis. People are losing their lives. People are ill. People are losing jobs. The economy's taking a hit. But we have to find the ways to say, no, we're also going to use this as an opportunity to build something better for when we come out the other end. And that's absolutely what the school that I lead is doing. And I have to say, I'm actually enjoying leading us through that part of it.
That's fantastic. And when is the book coming out? The book,
Well, this is
Experience Lessons for Military People.
The problem is being a dean. Actually, I'm working longer hours than I did when it was in person, and frankly, carving out the time is a little bit challenging. But I intend to begin writing over the summer.
Fantastic. Well, we look forward, Eliot, to following your progress on that, and hopefully look forward to catching your online course when there's an opportunity to do so. Because I've always been very, very interested. Having heard so much about it for so long, I would love to be able to check it out. Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Stay safe, and thanks so much for the time.
Thank you, and you and all your listeners as well. Take care of yourselves and be safe. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye. And thanks for joining us this week. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report. And check us out on LinkedIn. Look for our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight, bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.